side. Raffles darkened his lantern, and again we stood motionless till it had passed.
"Either a policeman," he muttered, "or a watchman that all of these jewellers run between them. The watchman's the man for us to watch. He's simply paid to spot this kind of thing."
We crept very gingerly down the stairs, which creaked a bit in spite of us, and we picked up our shoes in the passage, then down some narrow stone steps, at the foot of which Raffles showed his light, and put on his shoes once more, bidding me do the same in a rather louder tone than he had permitted himself to employ overhead. We were now considerably below the level of the street, in a small space with as many doors as it had sides. 3 were ajar, and we saw through them into empty cellars, but in the 4th a key was turned and a bolt drawn, and this one presently led us out into the bottom of a deep, square well of fog. A similar door faced it across this area, and Raffles had the lantern close against it and was hiding the light with his body, when a short and sudden crash made my heart stand still. Next moment I saw the door wide open, and Raffles standing within beckoning me with a jimmy.
"Door number 1," he whispered. "Deuce knows how many more there'll be, but I know of 2 at least. We won't have to make much noise over them either. Down here there's less risk."
We were now at the bottom of the exact fellow to the narrow stone stair on which we had just descended, the yard, or well, being the one part common to both the private and the business premises. But this flight led to no open passage. Instead, a singularly solid mahogany door confronted us at the top.
"I thought so,"
muttered Raffles, handing me the lantern, and pocketing a bunch of skeleton keys after tampering for a few minutes with the lock.
"It'll be an hour's work to get through that."
"Can't you pick it?"
"No, I know these locks. It's no use trying. We must cut it out. And it'll take us an hour."
It took us 47 minutes by my watch, or rather, it took Raffles, and never in my life have I seen anything more deliberately done. My part was simply to stand by with the dark lantern in one hand and a small bottle of rock oil in the other. Raffles had produced a pretty embroidered case, intended obviously for his razors, but filled instead with the tools of his secret trade, including the rock oil. From this case he selected a bit, capable of drilling a hole an inch in diameter, and fitted it to a small but very strong steel brace. Then he took off his covert coat and his blazer, spread them neatly on the top step, knelt on them, turned up his shirt cuffs, and went to work with brace and bit near the keyhole. But first he oiled the bit to minimize the noise, and this he did invariably before beginning a fresh hole, and often in the middle of one. It took 32 separate borings to cut around that lock. I noticed that through the first circular orifice Raffles thrust a forefinger. Then, as the circle became an ever-lengthening oval, he got his hand through up to the thumb, and I heard him swear softly to himself.
"I was afraid so."
"What is it?"
"An iron gate on the other side."
"How on earth are we to get through that?" I asked in dismay.
"Pick the lock. But there may be 2. In that case there'll be top and bottom, and we shall have 2 fresh holes to make, as the door opens inwards. It won't open 2 inches as it is."
I confess I did not feel sanguine about the lock-picking, seeing that one lock had baffled us already, and my disappointment and impatience must have been a revelation to me had I stopped to think. The truth is that I was entering into our nefarious undertakings with an involuntary zeal of which I was myself quite unconscious at the time. The romance and peril of the whole proceeding held me spellbound and entranced. My moral sense and my sense of fear were stricken by a common paralysis, and there I stood, shining my light and holding my file with a keener interest than I had ever brought to any honest avocation. And there knelt A.J. Raffles, with his black hair tumbled, and the same watchful, quiet, determined half-smile with which I have seen him send down over after over in a county match. At last the chain of holes was complete, the lock wrenched out bodily, and a splendid bare arm plunged up to the shoulder through the aperture and through the bars of the iron gate beyond.
"Now," whispered Raffles, "if there's only one lock, it'll be in the middle. Joy, here it is! Only let me pick it, and we're through at last."
He withdrew his arm, a skeleton key was selected from a bunch, and then back went his arm to the shoulder. It was a breathless moment. I heard the heart throbbing in my body, the very watch ticking in my pocket, and ever and anon the tinkle-tinkle of the skeleton key. Then, at last, there came a single unmistakable click. In another minute the mahogany door and the iron gate yawned behind us, and Raffles was sitting on an office table, wiping his face, with the lantern throwing a steady beam by his side. We were now in a bare and roomy lobby behind the shop, but separated therefrom by an iron curtain, the very sight of which filled me with despair. Raffles, however, did not appear in the least depressed, but hung up his coat and hat on some pegs in the lobby before examining this curtain with his lantern.
"That's nothing," said he, after a minute's inspection. "We'll be through that in no time, but there's a door on the other side which may give us trouble."
"Another door?" I groaned. "And how do you mean to tackle this thing?"
"Prise it up with the jointed jimmy. The weak point of these iron curtains is the leverage you can get from below, but it makes a noise. And this is where you're coming in, Bunny. This is where I couldn't do without you. I must have you overhead to knock through when the street is clear. I'll come with you and show a light."
Well, you may imagine how little I liked the prospect of this lonely vigil, and yet there was something very stimulating in the vital responsibility which it involved. Hitherto I had been a mere spectator; now I was to take part in the game, and the fresh excitement made me more than ever insensible to those considerations of conscience and of safety which were already as dead nerves in my breast. So I took my post without a murmur in the front room above the shop. The fixtures had been left for the refusal of the incoming tenant, and fortunately for us they included Venetian blinds which were already down. It was the simplest matter in the world to stand peeping through the lathes into the street, to beat twice with my foot when anybody was approaching, and once when all was clear again. The noises that even I could hear below, with the exception of one metallic crash at the beginning, were indeed incredibly slight, but they ceased altogether at each double rap from my toe, and a policeman passed quite half a dozen times beneath my eyes, and the man whom I took to be the jeweller's watchman oftener still, during the better part of an hour that I spent at the window. Once, indeed, my heart was in my mouth, but only once. It was when the watchman stopped and peered through the peep-hole into the lighted shop. I waited for his whistle. I waited for the gallows or the jail. But my signal had been studiously obeyed, and the man passed on in undisturbed serenity. In the end, I had a signal in my turn, and retraced my steps with lighted matches down the broad stairs, down the narrow ones, across the area, and up into the lobby where Raffles awaited me with an outstretched hand.
"Well done, my boy," said he. "You're the same good man in a pinch, and you shall have your reward. I've got £1,000 worth if I've got a penn'orth. It's all in my pockets. And here's something else I found in this locker. Very decent port and some cigars. Meant for poor dear Danby's business friends. Take a pull and you shall light up presently. I've found a lavatory too, and we must have a wash and brush up before we go, for I'm as black as your boot."
The iron curtain was down, but he insisted on raising it until I could peep through the glass door on the other side and see his handiwork in the shop beyond. Here 2 electric lights were left burning all night, and in their cold white rays I could at first see nothing amiss. I looked along an orderly lane, an empty glass counter on my left, glass cupboards of untouched silver on my right, and facing me the filmy black eye of the peep-hole that shone like a stage moon on the street. The counter had not been emptied by Raffles. Its contents were in the Chubb safe, which he had given up at a glance, nor had he looked at the silver, except to choose a cigarette case for me. He had confined himself entirely to the shop window,